Hi there, I'm Dr. Stephanie Falk, and I've had a couple of people reach out recently and ask me to address the concept of secondary trauma. So what is secondary trauma? Secondary trauma is the development of a cluster of symptoms, emotional in nature, some physical, some fatigue, some lethargy, difficulty with motivation, often inability to experience happiness, feeling down, feeling a little bit just negative and irritable in general. And these symptoms develop in the aftermath of an indirect exposure to trauma. So you're not the person that went through the trauma, but you've learned about it, you understand some of the details around it, a loved one has experienced a traumatic event, and it's incredibly disturbing to think through and to think about. Or maybe you witnessed a trauma. It could be maybe your teenage son has witnessed a car accident, which could be incredibly traumatic for your son. Maybe it's a healthcare worker that is working with patients dealing with COVID and death and loss. That's also an example of what could lead to the development of secondary trauma. The likelihood of developing secondary trauma usually relates to the frequency or the intensity in interaction with the details around the trauma. When those are more intense and or more frequent, then you're more likely to develop symptoms related to secondary trauma. So what do you do if it's you who's faced with secondary trauma? The first thing that I recommend is really establishing one good self-care measure a day. So each and every day, do one thing that helps you feel comforted, that helps you feel inspired, that helps you feel soothed, something that you can just kind of bank on that you do every day. It could be a morning walk, it could be morning meditation. It doesn't really matter what it is, but it's something that speaks to your soul by way of comfort. The second thing that you can do is really assess intentionality around having balance in life. I think after indirect exposure to trauma, the overarching idea is just a general sentiment of feeling unsettled, just feeling off. And so it's important to assess in your life ways that you can have a little bit more stability. And a good way to do that is to assess your sense of balance. Are you overworked? Are you spending too much time alone? Are you spending too much shared time? How can you have a little bit more balance and hence stability? And it'll help to dissipate some of the feelings of just kind of feeling off in life after experiencing indirect trauma. The third thing that I would encourage is talking about your feelings. It's nice to be able to talk to someone that has some understanding of the situation at hand, but if that's not the case, still allowing yourself to have time and space to process. It might be with a friend, it might be with a spouse, it might be with a professional. I think sometimes people don't feel justified in talking about their experience of secondary trauma because there's this kind of cultural narrative that says, well, at least you weren't the person that went through the trauma. Definitely not a helpful message. It's important to have space to process these things. So if you're not the person experiencing secondary trauma, but maybe a loved one is, so again, going back to that example, maybe you have a teenage son who witnessed a really horrific car accident. What can you do to help and support? First, validate how they feel. By way of example, hey, I know that it must be really difficult for you, with what you saw, and I can't imagine what it must feel like, but I want you to know that I know this is a big deal for you. So that can be an example of validating. I would ask and provide space to have conversation around it, but I certainly would not push. I wouldn't push the person to talk about the secondary trauma. I would simply invite. If you push or ask for details, it can actually make the situation worse and make the symptoms increase. Third thing that I would do is I would extend love and care and physical proximity. And so really being able to say, hey, I just want you to know that I'm thinking about you, I care about you, and I'm here for you. And then staying close physically. I think what that does, especially for youth, given our example that I was talking through, especially for youth, it allows them to know that just you're there, your presence is there, and if needed, they can reach out. And usually there's more willingness to do that if you're close in proximity. Last thing I think to keep in mind is that if we're at maybe 2 to 3 weeks out and the person who went through the indirect exposure to trauma is still really struggling with depressive symptoms, with lack of motivation, with negativity, irritability, I think that's probably a good time to consider getting some professional help. I hope it's been helpful to tune in, and I've elucidated just this concept a little bit. Secondary trauma is a very real thing, and I think that oftentimes, unfortunately, it goes overlooked because attention and focus gets placed on the person who experienced the trauma firsthand, as should happen. But other people who know about it or witnessed it are likely to be pretty seriously impacted as well. So again, I hope it's been helpful. If you don't want to miss a video, feel free to subscribe. And I hope this finds you having an absolutely beautiful day. Thank you.